Well, good evening, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Thank you for coming along to this King's Climate Dialogue. Welcome to the Department of Geography, who are hosting this evening, and in particular the King's Climate Group within the department, which is an interdisciplinary group of researchers interested in the relationships between climate and people. We've run a number of these climate dialogues, and this is the latest in our series. Just before we get going, just to point out that if you do need the toilets, there are ladies and gentlemen's toilets out of this door. Turn left and then left again if you do need those. And also to point out that we're not expecting any fire alarms, so if there is a fire alarm, then it's real and serious. And you should exit either through this door or through that door, turn right along the corridor and out through the main double doors into the quad outside, where you'll be cold, but you will be safe. So, welcome to this event, Governing Climate After the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement on climate change, as I'm sure you all know, lays out a huge ambition to, as it says, hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above the pre-industrial level and pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. And it gives the impression here that these are targets, or goals, that can be secured and achieved through various types of measures, policies, instruments, and interventions. And what we want to be exploring tonight is what sort of an agreement actually is the Paris Agreement. Is it a breakthrough stage in the negotiations that track back now over 20 years? Is actually the Paris Agreement simply more of the same that we've seen previously? Political aspiration, political rhetoric, but very little reality to back it up? Is this a politics of the possible or a politics of the impossible? We're interested in what role does this number or these numbers play? 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, how significant are they? What function do they have in the political world? And what happens next? We are still only 2 months after Paris. What happens in the next 10 months before the parties gather again in Marrakesh in Morocco? What happens after that? Is the Paris Agreement laying down a sufficiently strong challenge for, according to some people, the radical social transformation of the world's energy economy society that is needed? Is it laying down a sufficient challenge to technology? The argument of radical new carbon capture technologies, which people would argue are necessary if either 2 or 1 degrees are to be delivered. What about climate financing? Is the Paris Agreement a breakthrough for climate financing? And what about the enforcement regime? Does it matter that these are voluntary contributions from governments? And is that actually, in the end, going to provide sufficient incentive for governments to take responsibilities? And how does the Paris Agreement relate to wider concerns in the world around development, sustainable development, poverty eradication, social justice, political empowerment? What is the relationship between Paris and these other matters? So lots of questions that we can ask, and we will certainly be exploring answers to some of them, hopefully with your assistance as well during this evening. We have also 4 very distinguished colleagues and commentators and scholars that have joined me here to help us. And let me briefly introduce the 4 of them before I invite them to give some brief opening remarks. Dr. Oliver Geden, on my far left here, head of the research division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. Oliver has held positions in the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy in Berlin. He's also worked at the Institute of Technology in Zurich, the Institute of Media and Communication Policy in Berlin, and previously has been a visiting fellow at the University of California in Berkeley, and is an anthropologist by training, but a policy analyst and commentator by profession at the present time. Eva Lövbrand, to my left here, assistant professor in the Department of Thematic Studies for Environmental Change at Linköping University in Sweden, also affiliated with the Center for Climate Science and Policy Research, a political scientist and STS scholar. Eva's recently edited the most comprehensive volume of work on the idea of climate governance, together with Karen Brackstrand, the Research Handbook on Climate Governance, published just a few months ago. Professor Harriet Bulkeley from the Department of Geography, University of Durham, a geographer of great repute, concerned with questions around environmental governance, particularly in the context of urban city contexts, but also interested in the different ways in which climate governance plays out in transnational settings. And then Mark Pelling, who is professor here at King's College London in the Department of Geography, heading the Centre for the Integrated Research on Risk and Resilience. Mark is interested in the role of institutions and knowledge that shape vulnerability and adaptation to natural disasters, including those concerned with climate change. Mark has been involved with IPCC and ICSU, and most recently with the UN Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. And of course, I realize I've not said who I am. I am Mike Hulme, Professor of Climate and Culture here at King's College in the Department of Geography, and very happily chairing this evening's debate. So the evening will work. I will ask each of my colleagues here to make a few opening remarks in turn. Then I will perhaps pick up one or two important points that I may have picked up from those comments, and possibly elaborate on those. But in the meantime, getting you ready to offer your contributions as well. So we will then have about 30 or 40 minutes to gather some questions, comments, reactions, thoughts and views from you as participants here this evening. And I'll manage that process. We should be through together by 8 or just after 8 o'clock, at which point you're all invited next door to the Great Hall, just down the corridor, for a drinks reception. Do feel free to stay for as long as you can. I think we have to be out of there probably by 9 o'clock, and that will bring the evening to a close. Just one other thing I should say is that the event is being filmed and recorded this evening, and that will include your comments and questions. So we will ask you to speak into microphones. That's the point. Have I checked that the microphones are ready and available? They will be ready and available for that. So it will be filmed, recorded, and placed on YouTube shortly after today. So I think that's all I need to say by way of introduction. I will invite now Oliver to offer the first perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much. The microphone is working already. Yeah, what's the big deal about the Paris Agreement, and are the targets part of the big deal, the temperature targets? We want to assess what happened in Paris and what will be happening following Paris. We have to deal with the problem that the agreement itself and the decisions of the COP21 contain very vague language in many areas of the agreement. And you see that all the time in diplomatic negotiations, because if certain aspects are really contested, the way diplomats get around that is by what we call constructive ambiguity. So they produce ambiguous language and to be able to move on, because yeah, you can go into overtime at COPs for one day, maybe two, but then there are other things on your schedule. So many of these things that have been decided there remain rather unclear, and what they actually mean will be subject to interpretation in the coming years, but not I would say it's not being decided by the most sophisticated interpretation. This kind of framing game, of course, has already started in Paris, but I would say it's more what it actually means will be an outcome of ongoing power struggles between the parties to the UNFCCC, to the UN Climate Convention, and of course also by economic actors, non-state actors. So we don't know yet. What about the supposedly most non-ambiguous elements, the temperature target, numeric quantified temperature targets? Well, I would say Mike has already quoted Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, which says, okay, we want to hold the increase of the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees. Nobody really knows what well below means. I mean, at one point in time it had been 2 degrees, then the European Union started to introduce a below 2 degrees target. Now it's well below 2 degrees. It's kind of ambiguous there, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, always above pre-industrial levels. So we ask ourselves or ask the diplomats or the scientists, what could that mean? We have, of course, to take history of the UNFCCC into account, but also political rationality. So what leads to certain decisions at the UN level or in policy making or in politics? If we look at the 2 degrees target, there's a debate on the 2 degrees target since the mid-90s. The European Union, actually, the environment ministers, made a decision on that in 1996, I think, and then it went global, and Copenhagen was the first climate conference, UN climate conference, to recognize this kind of target. The IPCC, by the way, never did, because that would have been policy prescriptive in IPCC language. And the Cancun Climate Conference in 2010 then in a way made a formal decision on 2 degrees. So for years now we keep hearing the world should stay under 2 degrees. We decide that, but emissions have been growing ever since. Of course, economic modeling showing and scientific understanding of the world having a remaining emissions budget, a limited budget, to reach 2 degrees, says it should, of course, peak soon and go down. And that's really interesting. I have seen many analyses on the Paris Agreement citing that the leaders decided that we will have to see a peak in emissions very soon. And if you go back into all the COP decisions since Copenhagen, you will find the same sentence in every COP decision, that global emissions are going to peak very soon. So it makes you kind of skeptical of what's actually going on. So if you look at the economic modeling, the economic climate modeling, this will be very hard to keep temperature increase below 2 degrees. There is this limited budget, 1,000 gigatons of CO2 beginning in 2010. And the economists, because they see the emissions are still rising, already came up with a solution how to stay within that limited budget, although emissions are still rising, by creating a kind of a debt mechanism against that budget. So a budget overshoot will be allowed because there could be potentially, theoretically, payback with negative emissions somewhere down the road in the second half of the century. And that sounds like science fiction, and there are good reasons to think that is science fiction, but it's also mainstream climate economy today, to deal with negative emissions, net negative emissions in the second half of the century. And of course, this portion of negative emissions to be delivered, at least according to the models, by a combination of bioenergy and carbon capture and storage. That amount of negative emissions is of course higher if you go for 1.5 degrees. And so you can ask, if the world is not on track to stay under 2, why are they deciding now on 1.5? Why are they deciding now on an even more ambitious temperature target? And you can of course always ask, okay, are these climate targets still feasible. And there's one interesting aspect. If leaders decide on a target and if leaders celebrate that they have this deal, we always assume, okay, now the implementation phase will start. Now the target decision is like a choice between desired end states, and now measures will be defined, will be implemented. Maybe something goes wrong, but then we would call that an implementation failure. Maybe we could learn from that further down the road. But you could also say, if you look at the history of UN climate policy, even on national climate policies, that very often those decisions are not about choice, but have other functions within negotiations. And I would say regarding the 1.5C decision in Paris, those other possible functions include creating legitimacy for policymakers or for the negotiation process. Many people were saying, okay, if Paris fails, that might not be the end of UN climate negotiations, but it will lose the rest of credibility it has. Then always, if you have a nice target, you to put on the table, you're claiming responsibility for saving the planet. You're mobilizing short-term action within the negotiation process, and I think that's really evident here, to get developing countries, least developed countries, the OSIS countries on board. Europeans and others, the United States, had to move towards a 1.5 decision. And of course, and all these things are not necessarily bad. It's just other functions of such a target decision. And a fourth one would be recognizing climate risk, maybe creating a new benchmark for loss and damage and liability claims. The interesting thing, though, is that to fulfill all the other functions of this target decision, there is no actual implementation needed. I mean, it's already there. You decide to get all these things, and it works politically. So I would warn against expecting appropriate action now. We have not seen that with the 2 degrees target, and I think we will not see that with the 1.5 degrees target, because to stay within that budget, the world would have to be at zero emissions within 10 years. And I would say that sounds rather unfeasible to me. If you look at economic modeling within the IPCC or within the modeling groups that deliver mostly to IPCC Working Group 3, they would say you need negative emissions on the amount of 800 gigatons in the 21st century. So to put that into perspective, CO2 emissions are just below 40 gigatons today. So a volume worth of 15 to 20 years of today's annual emissions would have to go negative. So we have to go to zero at first, and then we need that kind of negative emissions. And I guess, yeah, and I guess no policymaker has thought about that. So I would say we should be cautious in the way we evaluate these targets. It won't say that no action would lead to no action, but not at the amount needed to keep increases below 1.5 or 2 degrees. So to conclude, what's the big deal about the Paris Agreement? I guess it's not, I would say, it's not the targets that have been decided on. And if you look at the so-called intended nationally determined contributions, what are countries willing to do, that leads to an increase of 3 degrees. So basically what Paris delivered is a 3 degrees agreement with a 1.5 degrees price tag. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. We'll move straight on to Eva Lövbrand, for your remarks as well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Well, I will approach the topic of tonight from the aspect of storytelling. So what sort of stories about the politics of climate change emerge from this UN climate conference in Paris? Where do these stories come from, and why do they matter? Climate change and climate governance is a domain populated by grand narratives, many of which you are very familiar with. The diplomatic efforts to negotiate an international response to climate change have developed in close correspondence to the daunting and increasingly urgent science story of human-induced climate change. And this is a story that has portrayed climate change as a collective action problem tied to rising emissions of greenhouse gases, the accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere, speaking to Oliver's intervention here, increasing global mean temperatures, melting ice caps, and extreme weather events. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Kyoto Protocol, which I'm sure you all have heard of, came about in the early and mid-1990s with the aim to prevent this dangerous human interference with the climate system. And these treaties, UN treaties, are grounded in the assumption that preventing dangerous human interference is best done by regulating states' access to the global atmosphere. So effective climate governance should therefore be organized around top-down negotiated targets and timetables for emission reductions. Now, some of you may remember that this global narrative of climate politics and governance took a serious blow at the UN Climate Conference in Copenhagen 6 years ago. This meeting was a culmination of many years of intense negotiations and was expected to form the basis for a new legally binding climate regime that would replace the Kyoto Protocol by the end of 2012. As you may remember, the meeting fell short of this aim. Early drafts of global emission cuts of 50 to 80% by 2050 were heavily challenged by major emitters such as the United States and China. And the meeting instead ended up taking note of a 3-page non-binding political agreement that we know as the Copenhagen Accord, which asks for voluntary and nationally appropriate emission reduction pledges from developed and developing countries. Now, in the 6 years that have followed the diplomatic crisis in Copenhagen, there has been a great deal of pessimism about the state and direction of UN conference diplomacy. The dominant story has been one of multilateral gridlock and power politics, the decline of EU leadership, the rise of new emission centers in the north and south, and the fragmentation of climate action. Interestingly though, and here comes the good news, this pessimistic narrative has also been challenged by a much more optimistic story of growing climate mobilization and experimentation in the transnational sphere. And this optimistic narrative has invited us to consider how cities, regions, corporations, and civil society are responding to climate change independently of what is going on in the multilateral process. Now, central to this alternative political narrative is the assertion that climate change cannot be reduced to this global atmospheric problem that can be fixed through a single and UN-coordinated climate regime. Instead, it should be understood as a nexus of interrelated problems tied to energy security, food security, the transportation sector, development pathways, and so on, which require a plurality of responses across all sectors of society. The argument that I would like to make here tonight is that the Paris Agreement needs to be understood in the light of the Copenhagen Conference and the competing stories of climate politics and governance that this conference gave rise to. Formally, the Paris Agreement institutionalizes the voluntary pledge and review regime that was inscribed in the Copenhagen Accord. So the treaty is organized around these 160 or so intended nationally determined contributions, the INDCs, that are intended to limit global mean warming well below 2 degrees Celsius, as we just heard. An interesting innovation, though, of this agreement is also that it makes reference to more than 10,000 voluntary climate action pledges by cities, corporations, investors, and civil society that have been submitted to the Nonstate Actors Zone for Climate Action. Informed by the story of bottom-up climate governance, the Paris Agreement, I would suggest, now offers a much more mobilizing story of collaborative governance that stipulates that and will engage major emitters in the north and south, but also business and civil society as partners in the transition to the low-carbon society. And I guess what I would like to argue here, perhaps in conflict, we'll see, with Oliver, is that we shouldn't underestimate the symbolic value of this optimistic Paris narrative. I agree that an important gap remains between the climate actions proposed by states and the 2-degree goal, and certainly the 1.5-degree target. But at the same time, this new story of collaborative climate governance breaks with the doom and gloom narrative from Copenhagen and may actually, even though we have this gap, reinstore confidence in UN conference diplomacy and the politics of the possible, or the power of politics. More importantly, perhaps, the Paris story also challenges the notion that climate governance is a strictly intergovernmental affair and emphasizes the importance of scaled-up civic involvement, mobilization, and experimentation. And I will end my intervention here by saying that I think the major problem of climate policy making in the years that have followed Paris has not been the gap between mitigation ambitions stipulated in the international treaties that we have seen and the actual emission trajectories, but the lack of political imagination on how to close that gap. So in view of that argument, I believe that the new era of climate policy experimentation that might unfold after Paris actually can help us to explore new political possibilities and hopefully enliven the imaginative worlds that shape how we think about and respond to the problem of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. Very good. And so moving now to Harriet Bulkeley, we'll invite you to make some remarks as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And I'll very much take off from where Eva's left off there. From my perspective, why Paris matters is because I think it's the most public acknowledgement yet that we've had so far that climate politics is changing. If you think back to the Kyoto Protocol, we had a kind of context of making climate politics where we were expecting the Kyoto Protocol to tell us what to do. And in a sense, what's happened at Paris is that the Paris Agreement has been expecting a whole set of other actors to tell Paris and the Conference of the Parties what to do. So we've almost kind of inverted it from a sort of small chorale of officials and policymakers kind of trying to disseminate carbon markets and other tools and targets across the world. And instead you can kind of think of the Paris Agreement as more of as a funnel, or perhaps a lucky dip where we're just throwing a whole set of things into it. We're hoping that something good is going to come out of the bottom. So it's really, in a sense, an inversion of how we thought about climate politics. So we might have used to see these meetings that happen every year and they kind of gather importance over a set of years. You know, every 4 or 5 years there seems to be a very important climate conference. We used to see them as opportunities to solve the climate problem, as a site where the kind of silver bullets, a carbon market here, an international agreement or target there, would be galvanized, which would effectively save the planet. And we had this very much a sort of, if you like, a kind of superhero narrative to kind of play on the stories that we told. But if there's a breakthrough, then perhaps it is that we have to let go of the idea that there is somewhere a climate superhero. Few people have tried to play that character, including Arnold Schwarzenegger and Al Gore and other people. I think they would all look very good in a sort of climate superhero uniform. But I think, on the other hand, we need to kind of get that image out of our heads and feel that there isn't somewhere hiding in the wings, in this lecture theatre or anywhere else, a superhero who is going to ride to our rescue and save the planet. And indeed, we have rather packed the climate change agenda with all sorts of our hopes and dreams. And Mike, when he introduced it, mentioned eradicating poverty, achieving sustainable development, and global justice, as well as saving the climate. I mean, it seems to be rather a lot that we have been asking for climate change. So, in a sense, I think what we've seen at Paris is a shift from thinking of these meetings as a site of solution to, if you like, a site of resolution. It's quite an important difference. Some of you will be like me and will make New Year's resolutions. You will also then know that you probably don't keep them totally strictly for the whole year, and that sometimes there's a little bit of slip here and there, and that generally there's an intention to say do more exercise or only drink alcohol at the weekends or whatever it might be. But those things do tend to not always be strictly followed. So my sense is that what we're seeing now in climate politics internationally is a set of resolutions. Climate change at Paris was resolved again. We resolved to take more action. We resolved that climate change is still on the agenda. We resolved that this matters to a whole host of different actors. We know it's not the solution, but we have a resolution towards wanting to take action. Now, Eva's pointed to some of the reasons why this has happened, and I'll just phrase it in my own terms. I think, firstly, climate change has become too big an issue to be contained in any one particular site or set of actors, engagements, or agreements. And in fact, this is an idea that Mike wrote about in his book about why we disagree about climate change. That climate change has become a ubiquitous idea, like democracy or equality, that is part of our society. And we know we want a more democratic society. We know we want a more equal society. But we know we will never have an equal society or a totally democratic society. So climate change becomes something that we continually work on, and we work on it through multiple different kinds of sites and spaces. It's important to remember then that climate change is not all we're trying to do. We are trying to achieve good development, eradicate poverty and justice at the same time. It's not everything. But it's in some ways a success of climate change that it has become circulated and integrated and mainstreamed into everything, from, milk in the supermarket, which will be low carbon milk or not, through to, whether you want to offset your, apparently you can now offset your children if you have a child, so you can give somebody the gift of offsetting their child for 18 years. You can do that. You can do almost anything in relationship to climate change if you want. So it has become ubiquitous, and at the same time that might give it this kind of slippery quality that we feel that it's escaping from us, we can't hold on to it. But at the same time, in a sense, that's a success of it as an issue. The second reason why I think it's become sort of exceeded the boundaries of being something that we can solve is because it's become part of the agenda of so many new and different actors. And we mentioned the NASCAR, as it's called, the Nonstate Actors Zone for Climate Action or something. Can't quite remember the acronym now, but it's a really interesting set of actors, 10,000 voluntary commitments to take action on climate change. Some researchers at Oxford have done, they've been very involved with the process, but also have done some initial work on what that group looks like. It contains a fifth of the world's population, 2/3 of the companies that make up the economic value of the top 500 companies in the world, and 15 out of 20 of the largest banks. Now, I mean, there are a few other organizations in that 10,000, surely, but that's at least some interesting actors who've started to think of climate change as part of who they are and what they do. So from banks to supermarkets, high-tech companies like Google, Mars & Co., and so on and so forth, you have a whole host of actors who think of climate change as their business. But for me, of course, as Mike introduced me, my work has mainly looked at cities, and I'm very interested in what's been happening in the urban arena here. And one of the things we can say about cities is that they have really kind of come into the limelight in the Paris conference. Cities first started acting on climate change together in about 1991, and for a long time they felt themselves a sort of Cinderella at the climate change ball, they're sort of not really able to join into the international negotiations, not really having the right clothes to wear, and wondering how they were going to get there. But it seems that the shoe now fits for cities, and everyone wants some city climate change action. The rooms at the Paris conference, which were about cities, were totally overflowing, and all sorts of different actors were involved with that. And collectively, something like 6,000 cities and towns across Europe have signed up to the Covenant of Mayors. They have reduced their emissions together by more than 20% of their emissions in 1990, and they all have higher ambitions than we currently have written into the Paris Agreement. So I think post-Paris there are many reasons to be cheerful, maybe 6,000 or so reasons to be cheerful if you're an urban researcher. Climate change has become, central to this kind of urban agenda. And I just want to close by making 3 comments about what I think that tells us about what climate politics post-Paris might look like, and then 3 short comments on what some of the dangers of that are. So firstly, I think what we can see in the cities domain is that climate change is never done just for climate change's sake. No city government wakes up one morning and says, right, we're just going to do this stuff on climate change, we're not going to do anything else. They all relate climate change to something else that is important to their city, whether that's energy security or retrofitting ceilings in housing that is of low quality, or addressing wastewater problems, or whatever it is. It's climate change plus something else. And that tells us that as we try and do action internationally, we mustn't try and keep climate change separate from other agendas. It must be part of the other things we want to do. Secondly, it tells us that this kind of dispersed and devolved, differentiated forms of governance can work. There aren't cities out there saying, well, I'm not going to do this unless you do it at the same time. And if you're going to do 5%, well, I think I'll do 4%. That doesn't happen. There's a kind of sense of a collective, but not interdependent form of governance. Collectively, there's action, but it's not dependent on what each other actor's doing. So that tells us that the INDC process could work if it's orchestrated, to use a word that we've been using quite a lot today, in the right way. And thirdly, counting carbon matters in these cities, trying to work out how they've reduced their emissions. Having indicators for resilience and adaptation also matters in terms of being able to show that they have performed. But it matters mostly because it's how they're achieving and accessing climate finance. Climate finance and what the different development banks and what the different donor organisations are doing in the urban sphere will be absolutely critical to what happens around climate change in the next 10 years, as far as I can see. The challenges of this are that as we try and count all of this great stuff that's happening in cities, we might squash it all. It's all very innovative, it's quite fragile, it's small, and if we come in with really big requirements for measurement and verification, people might just say, well, I can't be bothered, it's not going to be worth it. Every little bit of carbon is difficult to count and collect together. There's a challenge of scaling it out. There's lots of good action happening, but how do we make it sort of reach the bits of the systems that are difficult to change? Particularly transport is an area which has seen much less action, for example, than, say, energy. So that's an issue. And finally, just to close on the point that as this climate action moves into these other sites and spaces and other actors get involved, we must also remember that some of the key issues that we've negotiated globally about justice, about who does what, why, and who's responsible, are just as important when we look at the urban scale. You can take a city like London, or you can take a city like Cape Town or Mumbai and say, well, which parts of those cities should have the most responsibility for addressing climate change? Has everybody got the same responsibility, or does level of income, ability to act, do those things matter as much when you're in the urban arena as they do when you're in the international arena? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Harriet. So finally to Mark Pelling for your remarks. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mike. I'm the adaptation person on the panel. I'm also perhaps the international development person on the panel as well. So I can talk from my research in Latin America, the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, not so much South Asia, but more recently as well from Europe and North America too. But there's very much talking from the research, obviously, not from personal experience of living in those contexts. Mike's asked us to reflect on the Paris Agreement and asks, what does the Paris Agreement matter? And from an international development perspective, I guess we step back a little bit and say, does climate change matter? If one is confronted with deep and growing inequalities that express themselves through opportunities for women and girls to access education and basic health care, for men and women, boys and girls to access clean drinking water, sanitation, safe housing, security, and freedom from violence. Does climate change matter? Well, I guess I wouldn't be on this panel if I thought it didn't matter. So it does matter, and it matters in very deep ways. But from my perspective, it matters mainly if adaptation to climate change can open up opportunities for progressive development. And so this is not co-benefits with development. This isn't adaptation to climate change that enables existing development processes to continue, based on the recognition that many of those development processes that lead to who lives where in a city, who accesses basic needs in a city, who gets access to loans in the countryside, or information that determines when crops are planted and so on. Many of those systems that one might normally protect through adaptation, of course, form the parameters of risk. It's much more nuanced than that in reality. But I present that to you as a sort of provocative start, that climate change is important, adaptation is important, and it opens this really quite exciting opportunity to revisit failed and unmet development challenges. If it doesn't do that, then I'd say, Paris and the climate change agenda is failing. there's a term that's been used to coin some of that agenda, which is transformation. It's a term now which has become very popular across a whole suite of policy areas, but in adaptation it means that. It's adaptive action that enables scope for alternative development to emerge. And we've gone through a process through the IPCC of emergence of that term. We now have that, and we're moving in, I think, now to a period of questioning whether that idea is actionable. So, in reality, on the ground, can climate change adaptation really meet this promise, or is it just a lovely idea that is perhaps a distraction? But coming back to Paris then, and just a couple of thoughts. Looking through my presentation, I've got lots of twos. One's meant to have lots of threes in presentations, aren't you? So anyway, bear with me.
Very black and white.
Yes, that's right, yes. Dialectical as ever. So, so two things that maybe talk to this agenda. One is around the discourse and the symbolism of Paris, 1.5 and 2 degrees, which is very motivating, as we've heard, but maybe is also very dangerous if we believe it can happen. It might take one's eye off the possibility of dangerous climate change, so really significant systemic shifts in climate systems that will lead to very deep changes in agricultural systems, access to water, and so on. No, I mean, this is still very much a possibility, and one should be thinking about how one moves organisations, legislation, and so on to meet that possible future mid-century, perhaps a bit beyond. But it's part of the imagination of adaptation that would be dangerous to lose. The second element that comes from Paris, I think, is money. So there's now much more promise of money around adaptation, and also around the loss and damages agenda. So there's a sort of compensation idea that if you can show existing development and the adaptive capacity that brings has been overwhelmed by a climate signal, then there's a possibility to gain money to meet that gap. Of course, all sorts of challenges there around proving those cases. But there's money. Does that mean, I think, as some of the other members of the panel have suggested, that climate change becomes a scapegoat for everything, or that you have to have climate change adaptation in your framing of a policy if you want sanitation, if you want improved market access in a rural area? So it's going to distort development. So those are both two, I guess, opportunities, positives, but with a little caveat as well. Now, of course, Paris isn't alone, and last year we had the Sustainable Development Goals, and also, I suppose, a more niche agenda, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, was signed. And both of these place climate change adaptation firmly in the development arena. And they ask us, much as the idea of transformation does, to think about procedural and distributional justice. So who is it that's involved in decision makings, and who benefits or loses from those decisions around adapting, around protecting ourselves from risk or threat, and recovering from any impacts. So I just want to throw two quick examples at you of places where we've worked that illustrate some of the ways in which there may be emergent procedural and distributional justice opportunities, actually, and then a quick reflection on how science might need to or could position itself around that agenda. So the two quick examples, one from the UK and one from the Dominican Republic. In the UK, it's a small town on the south coast that we work with, working there now, and this is a small town that has grown or is about to grow by 30%. So planning has been given for a large new housing estate on land which is not defended from the sea, from the coast. It's a place that is exposed to flooding. The seawall itself anyway, in about 10 to 15 years, will need replacement. And we've worked to model sea level rise, to model cost-benefit analysis of particular adaptation options, and also to model the adaptive capacity of this town based on its own capacities for experimentation and accessing funds and so on, those of the district and then national actors. And what's come out of this is that none of the preferred adaptation options are at all possible. Essentially, the seawall will not get national funding to be enhanced or extended in any way. It's the goalposts keep moving. So through that science engagement, the local community now recognises they have to live with the prospect of flooding, despite this 30% increase in the population. And that opens up, you can imagine, a whole range of thoughts and conversations. And in terms of this, what does adaptation mean? It has led to a group of small towns on the south coast coming together to basically reflect on what they feel is a marginalisation from UK planning and national policy across the board. So a positive space perhaps opened up. The other example comes from the Dominican Republic. It's an informal settlement called Los Manguitos in Santo Domingo. And there, just to be very brief, an urban disaster risk reduction policy set of projects led by Oxfam, Spanish Oxfam, sought to provide emergency pathways, so it's a low-lying area exposed to hurricanes but also flooding, some bridges between communities that actually were fighting before gang violence, and to improve community relations with the police. People didn't go to hurricane shelters, partly because they were aware their belongings would be stolen, but also that they'd get molested by the police if they went to the shelters. So a whole range of deep issues about social relations, poverty, the works. So they got these stairs, they got the bridge, and they got better relations with the police. That's lovely. The real benefit, though, is that children can go to school. The neighbouring groups realised that they actually did get on, and so gang violence has almost disappeared because the youth have got to know each other. Land values have increased, and new livelihoods have been formed because people can take their products to market. None of that was planned. None of that was in the brief that Oxfam put to DIPECO, the European Community Humanitarian Office, for this funding. So in both of those cases, the real outcomes of a science intervention and a policy intervention are unplanned for. They're not to do with climate change, they're to do with ongoing development. And they're both very local. And so I guess the question to the floor, and what I'm trying to think through, is how do those unexpected real benefits get brought into this calculus of climate change and development? So in my last minute or so, just to think about how science perhaps could engage with that, and just a recognition, many people have said this, that science and science voices are quite good and well connected at the very high level. Policy, expert advisory to policy is established, and that enables existing policy to make incremental change. Pretty good also at the very local level, so NGOs and community activists working to affect change, which can be quite deep in terms of people's values, sense of identity, livelihood opportunities, whatever, but stays local. There are very few examples of that local change that works its way up. And the proposition then is that the place that one could work more as an academic, and I guess this conversation around targets and so on opens that up as well, is the middle space. The space where politicians act to form policy, where technical experts are using tools, indicators to map what they do. That's a legitimate place for science because it's a technical space, yet it's a space where values, social values, are remade through these tools, through the indicators, but tend not to be challenged. So the proposition is to work more at that level, but not to proliferate yet more tools and models. And every paper in academia needs a framework and then an example, so not necessarily more frameworks, but a stepping back and an appraisal of the implications for the values in society that this proliferation of tools and indicators engenders, and if there are leverage points there in critiquing these tools that might allow a richer discussion about values. In my own environment of working like Harriet in urban contexts, there are really many tools that have sprung up in the last 3 or 4 years that seek to describe resilience in particular, but also adaptive capacity. These are very nice, but they reduce down the urban to a set of discrete indicators. So the question is, can we engage with that way of thinking about cities, not to reify them, but to use it as a leverage to get then at some of these interesting, unexpected opportunities that perhaps climate change adaptation gives us. So that's why I'm interested in climate change. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We can just give a round of applause to all four. So we're certainly very interested in your thoughts on the Paris Agreement. So be ready to have your comments or questions, indeed, back to any of the panelists and see whether your reading of the Paris Agreement matches any of these four readings that you've heard from the frontier, or if not, then offer your own, or a challenge to the panel. They've missed something very important about Paris that hasn't been represented here, so have that in mind. I'm just interested, trying to read across the four contributions here. There were different ways in which these four commentators sought to interpret Paris, the Paris Agreement, seemed to me. One common thread might be something around narratives and storytelling. So Oliver talked about the fiction, climate fiction of 1.5 degrees as a target that had symbolic value rather than substantive value. Eva's offering an optimistic narrative around Paris, inheriting from Copenhagen, but actually opening up the political imagination of what could be done through different types of civic engagement with climate change. Harriet wanted us to get away from the superhero narrative, leave that behind, but also to think of creative ways in which the idea of climate change can actually engender change on the ground, particularly in cities. And then Mark, looking at this from the perspective of development, does climate change matter? And suggesting that maybe Paris is really carrying simply symbolic value, again, rather than anything more substantive or tangible than that. Does that make you all very cynical about the negotiators? Or do you actually agree that it was a significant achievement? I just wonder, maybe Oliver, would you, because I mean you offered a view of the unreality, certainly behind these targets. Does that make you cynical of this process and what the negotiators are actually embarked on? Are they dishonest? Or actually is there just a different type of honesty that is being embarked on in these international settings?
I wouldn't say another type of honesty, I would say another type of rationality. So of course people were celebrating for getting the deal done because it has been so hard to get any meaningful deal done. So if you're there in Paris for these 2 weeks and you're negotiating basically for years, then of course you're happy you're getting the deal done. Maybe you overestimate the substance of the deal. You would see that in every ministry around the world, that people somehow confuse the effort that was needed to get a deal with the quality of the deal. But that's kind of a professional deformation of public servants and people working in public administration. I mean, I was supposed to give my view on the target side, and I'm very critical about that, but I agree with Eva and even with Harriet that it is a really an important shift towards another kinds of momentum of action, because until Paris we have seen very, very ambitious target but no appropriate action, because we had this top-down superhero scheme that couldn't work out. So now we will see more action, a groundswell of action maybe, but it will not deliver these kinds of targets. So I would say, I'm happy to see more action on the ground, but it will not close the gap, because simply the gap is too large, too big. But compared to what we have seen so far, I'm happy to see more action on the ground. So it's also a positive note, but Paris was, we tried to say, okay, we can deliver it all, we can combine top-down and bottom-up, and we don't have a legally binding. The treaty is binding, but not emissions reduction target. But we still will be able to deliver emissions reductions path that are very ambitious, and I can't see that.
And maybe Harriet, just picking up on your the metaphor of the superhero narrative, and Paris was an opportunity to finally ditch that. Have you reflected on why are superhero narratives so attractive? And I mean, to take your line of reasoning, you know, why for 25 years have we gone down that path? And yet here we are in 2016 saying that path of thinking that through this particular setting, through this particular process, through these particular individuals, through these superheroes, that there will be the I mean, the Copenhagen thing was all about the FAB deal, wasn't it? Ambitious and binding for, what was the F? Anyway. But why, what was it? Fair, ambitious and binding. Why have we been seduced by this attraction of the superhero?
Probably, but I mean, I'm on very, very thin ice here because narrative analysis and literature is really not my thing at all. But I think that we are all familiar with the attraction of a superhero storyline, and it is supposed to be one of the sort of fundamental ways of telling stories that we have in our culture, from Jaws to Beowulf to all of these other stories are all about being rescued by a superhero. So there's one thing which is a very common and in some senses comforting story, to be at risk and then to have somebody save us. I mean, that's just a story that we like to tell ourselves, and we tell it about many, many different things and have historically told it. So there is a sort of familiarity with that narrative that we'll find in many other places in literature for, you know, thousands of years. So there's that. But it is rather comforting to think that climate change is something that other people are going to save us from, rather than to think that actually, you know, tomorrow when I decide to travel to work, I have to travel in a different way, because that's my politics. So that's the site of the political is actually my fridge or my front door or my car or my decisions about what clothes I buy or whatever. And while I'm somebody who, I don't think that it's appropriate to charge the responsibility of saving the planet on a superhero at the international level, but neither do I think that that is appropriate to charge it on individuals each and every day having to make decisions in isolation from any kind of structural change. It is somewhere in between, and we'll come back to Mark's kind of messy middle there, between saying, you know, okay, each one of you tomorrow go out, turn off your lights, you know, save the planet, which tends to be a kind of narrative about public engagement, which I think is equally disabling. You know, none of us are superheroes either, if you like. So it is about some form of collective action that is about practical decisions every day, this kind of resolution, this resolve to, you know, try again the next day, even if you have not been totally successful at doing your exercise plan that day. Okay, tomorrow you still have another chance to go and do some more exercise. Well, you know, we haven't been totally successful in saving the world yesterday, but, you know, tomorrow we could all do something a bit different. We can still do it. So I think for me, that's why it's an interesting and positive story. But I can see why the climate superhero is such an attractive model.
Okay, right. Well, let's go to you, the audience, and I will look for some hands, and I'll take 3 or 4 comments, contributions, and then invite some reactions here from the panel. So I've got 4 hands that I've now seen. So I'll come. So the chap at the back, and then the lady here. Oh, yeah. There should be a roving mic somewhere. Yeah? Do we have one? Yeah. So, okay. Over this side, right in the very middle.
You just put it in the middle and get somebody to pass it back. Maybe give one out to Steph.
Yeah, Mia, could you take one on the other side as well? For the lady in the middle here. Okay.
Is it on?
Yep.
My name's Dave Steinbach. I'm a researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development in the Climate Change Group. So I just want to pick up on the question about narratives, or the point about narratives that you made. You know, I think we would see, at IID, we would see that Paris is sort of day one. It's a starting point for a lot more action. So one of the main things that I think you haven't sort of outlined is this ratcheting up mechanism and the, going back every 5 years. So on the topic of narratives, two interrelated questions. One, is it positive or negative that this is being framed as a sort of better than we could have expected outcome versus what we actually need? I think from an LDC perspective, there's a lot that they wouldn't have expected to have gotten in this, so it's positive. But is that an okay framing? And then second, is it positive that we're moving now from a political narrative to a technocratic narrative? From a sort of, we signed the deal, but now we have to get the details right.
Okay, thank you. And the lady here?
Good evening, thank you. My name is Anna, and I was just wondering, because we are also at the same time that Paris Agreement was signed, the same actors are actually signing or are on the way to sign an agreement that is TTIP, and I think they're a little bit exclusive.
That is what, sorry?
TTIP and what they are both...
The transatlantic trade.
Exactly.
Sorry.
So I think they are a bit exclusive. How, and in a way it's kind of, yeah, but how can they actually meet their goals with the climate agreements and then at the same time sign TTIP?
Okay, thank you. And then Peter here, if you could pass that along to the person, no, the person here. Yeah, the person there. Peter.
Peter Gingold from Tipping Point. I think it's for everybody, perhaps Harriet in particular. Was I hearing that you think that the superhero role is being taken perhaps by not superheroes but pretty good heroes by the smaller actors, the big businesses, the cities, etc. Are they now taking on that role instead of the state? And in fact, if that's true, was Paris really just a sort of a perfectly harmless bit of enthusiasm by some diplomats, but otherwise kind of irrelevant?
Okay, thank you. And the gentleman there, yes.
Should be walking, yes. I'm Nicola Ortu. I'm a student here in the Department of War Studies, but I'm also a member of the European Youth Parliament, and I'm about to deal with the topic of climate change and specifically the Paris Agreement. My question is very narrow to the actions that the European Union, as a single actor in the Paris Agreement, should take in order to meet the criteria of the agreement. So how then also can a huge international institution coordinate from an inner level, so the coordination of an international institution with the single state actors that form it?
Okay, good, thank you. So four questions. Not answers to all of them, but choose. I mean, maybe on that last one, Oliver. I mean, you've worked certainly a lot with the German government and also in the EU context. What is an appropriate EU reaction?
Well, nobody knows, and that has to be played out politically right now. I mean, many NGOs and environmentalists say, okay, now the EU has to step up with its own target, minus 40% until 2030 compared to 1990. But in that system we have right now with the so-called INDCs, intended national determined contributions, they will skip the I later. The question is now, should the EU strengthen its target? And the EU Commission has already said, well, we will wait for another stock taking on a global level, maybe we'll do it. But actually, they can't really do it because of the internal divisions within the European Union. So if the Commission or the so-called Green Growth Group of member states in the European Union would now say, okay, we would like to see a minus 50% target, Poland and other Visegrad states would simply say no. And that would be it. So to avoid that situation, the Commission is not even trying to raise that question right now. And it's very interesting, you can see it in the United States now, not only with the Supreme Court decision, but also with the struggles about the replacement for Scalia, and of course the elections coming up. What are intended NDCs are really worth? What is the ratchet mechanism really worth? Where I really await the procedural rules, because the so-called INDCs are not in a shape that they're really comparable and would really given the history of the UNFCCC, I will really be curious what will be counting as a progression from an INDC before. There are no procedural rules. There can't be procedural rules right now, but very often we have seen if the states are going to the details, in the more technical details, when the world is not looking, they try to define rules that make it easier for them. So the EU right now is stuck with a minus 40% target. NGOs say it's not enough. According to the IPCC, it's impossible to say what is a fair contribution of a single country or another entity. They all had a requirement to put into their INDCs a reasoning why their offer is fair and balanced. And they all found a way to express why their national target is fair and balanced in a global sense. So that's what you get if you have a voluntary system.
Eva, on narrative, how to read Paris then? Is it better than expected? Is that what we should be thinking of it, or is it not enough from a developing country perspective? And I think the point was, have we moved from a political setting now to a really technical or technocratic one? How should we read Paris, I think is the question.
Well, isn't it both? I mean, it's better than we expected, but certainly not enough. So, I think I would like to reinstate that I think it's really important that we have now left the era of gridlock, of doom and gloom, and open up a space where we may start to think about the politics of the possible. And if the Paris Agreement allows us to do that, that's a significant achievement. If it starts to mobilize even more than what we've seen in the 6 years that followed the Copenhagen conference, it's certainly not enough, and we will need to think about, be creative beyond just technical measures. But I have great hope in sort of the power of imagination here and experimentation. I think in the best of worlds, this diversity of pledges and actions that we have now seen through the INDCs, but also in the non-state actors of climate action, there may actually be quite, and they vary a lot. I mean, they're very different in the kinds of ambitions that they stipulate and the specificities of the actions, with the EU being perhaps having the shortest INDC of them all, and perhaps the most technical one. I think that there is quite a lot of promise in this diversity and the multiple stories about climate action after Paris. So I think I remain optimist, even though of course we should not be satisfied. And I think the job of our scholarship is obviously to critically scrutinize this positive story and give it empirical substance and life. That's our job to sort of see how this now is going to be translated into practice.
Okay, thank you. Now we're back to heroes, I'm afraid. Superheroes. Have we moved from superheroes to rather modest or mini heroes?
Well, I think two kind of main things to say there. Some of these actors are not that small. I mean, we're talking about California, or we're talking about Google, or Mars and Co. So, London, same emissions as Sweden, that kind of thing. So some of the actors that we're talking about are not small. They just have different kinds of boundaries around them from the ones that we're used to. I think we have seen those actors kind of come into the fray, as it were, but they are deeply interconnected with what's going on with the states, with the nation states, and with the international negotiations. Firstly, it's harmless negotiations, harmless activities by lots of bureaucrats who've got their own culture about what constitutes success. But without that kind of set of norms about what the world should be achieving, then the actions of those individual industries or cities aren't organised, they're not related to something, a central kind of storyline, if you like. So it needs to be there for that reason. But equally, many of the actions that we're seeing in the urban arena or by corporations are deeply entwined with national governments already. Nation states are sponsoring, enabling, providing the legislative background, the policy context, all of those things for those other actors to work. So I think it's reasonably important that we don't try to separate the state and the non-state, but rather see it as agency to achieve things with climate change that's worked out in between them, that they both need the other. In terms of whether these are superheroes, mini-heroes, in a sense, I hope that this is more of a quest storyline now. We're going away from the superhero one, and rather than a farce. I guess that's maybe where we're achieving there. This is a kind of sense of a collective action. Quests are always done by groups. There's not a single hero. A quest is something that we do together, and maybe that's what we should resolve to do.
Okay, and Mark, we've got a couple of things. As the transatlantic trade agreement can these two things be reconciled as being negotiated? I mean, sort of Europe across to America, or there's actually also this question: is Paris a moment where we've left the politics of climate change behind, and we're now simply it's a series of technical issues? Either of those, fancy?
Yeah, and some of the others as well, but I'll be brief. In terms of interpreting the negotiations, I guess there was a sort of collective view that at least there was agreement. And if it was a celebration of something, it's a celebration of internationalism, maybe something to do with climate policy, but it shows that nation states are still relevant on the international stage. So, you know, the stakes were even higher than climate change in that respect. If this had failed, we would have gone back a step further, and some of the other policy actors that Harriet's mentioned would rise, and there are all sorts of implications if global trends in development are, if the energy for that is taken even further from nation states and given to large private and sub-sovereign actors. So it was a great thing that nation states, from my perspective, asserted themselves. Of course, the real work has to then be after the agreement, and that requires strong local actors, in the ideal with a strong nation state as well. The Sendai framework is very explicit about that. I know the details of Paris less clearly, but in Sendai it's very clear about calling for national policy platforms with strong science platforms alongside them. In terms of the economics question, whether this is also just a case of narrative or opportunism, or if there's some depth, who knows, but you'll be familiar with the World Economic Forum's statement just of a few weeks ago, actually overlapping with the Sendai Agreement. They sort of brought out this risk register, and disaster events were there for the first time as part of the risk. So it's now part of the narrative, even at that level of kind of high finance. But of course, there are deep tensions. Yeah.
Okay, so another round of questions and comments. So I see one there, one down here, and Eric. So I've got three. There's one at the end. We'll take these four. So yeah, Eric, if you want to go first.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. My name is Eric Milstone. I work at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex, and I work on food and agriculture policy. My question is occasioned by the fact that following the Paris Agreement, many of my pals working on food and agriculture were agitated by the fact that they could see no reference to agriculture and food system in the agreement, even though, well, estimates vary of the impact of the food and agricultural system on climate change, but some of them go as high, between 20 and 30% of total impact on greenhouse gas emissions. Now, my question then is, were they just being wholly unrealistic to expect a particular sector like that to be specifically addressed in this agreement, or was there some serious hole in the middle of the donut?
Okay, thank you. I'll just pass it along here to Cherry.
Hi, my name's Cherry Norton. I'm a master's student here at King's. I wanted to ask about the targets. So you talked about the positive aspects of having this creative fiction of 1.5 degrees, and how it gives legitimacy and gives, for policymakers. But I'm interested in what you think the negative aspects of having, of taking climate change down to a single figure, and whether that diverts attention away from challenging other issues like the political and social order that actually created the problem in the first place.
Okay, thank you. Just pass your mic to Mia there. And the gentleman there, yeah.
Hello, Big Spark. I'm a low-carbon new venture chap. Coming on to narratives, quests, supervillains, whatever, there seem to be competing narratives within specific countries. That of the climate superhero versus that of the climate supervillain, sometimes viewed as the economics superhero. I could comment on energy policy in the UK, but shan't. My question to all of you, within the scope of what you said this evening, is how do you see governance of climate change in relation to the Paris Agreement playing out if a Republican wins the US presidential election?
Okay, and there was one question from the gentleman behind you, if you could pass it back.
Hi, I'm Fergus, and I'm a second-year environmental policy student from LSE. And I have two sort of related questions, I guess. So my first one would be, would you, with the increase in the importance of non-state actors and individual actors, would you see that COP is, and the associated states are now becoming more and more irrelevant in an international decision-making sphere and the action that they can take? And also, considering that because Copenhagen and the Accord was such a low baseline, are we sort of blinded by the fact that we know that's a baseline, that the lowest baseline they have, and the fact that the Paris agreements, for example, the INDCs was just a small advancement on what they agreed in the Accord. So in the Accord it was voluntary, and now it's binding, but they don't actually have to act on these INDCs. Then are we sort of blinded by the fact that because they have achieved something over Copenhagen means that now they're a success? Thanks.
Okay, so we'll go maybe the opposite way this time. And do you want to comment? We've got questions about agricultural sector or particular sectors, whether we would expect those to be seen here. What happens if a Republican wins the presidency?
Yeah, great questions.
Has the Paris Agreement actually taken attention away from the nation state? And is that a good thing?
Sure.
And then there was the question about the reductionism that's implied in these targets.
So around agriculture, I mean, there's a very interesting tension that's emerging between the rural and the urban, of course. So the urban is very resurgent, but one doesn't want that to take away from the rural. These are two connected systems in many ways. People recognise that, but I guess the policy voice of the urban is there. One saw it also in the SDGs. There's an urban SDG, there's water, there's food security, but there is sort of a rural SDG, if you like. In Sendai, it's very generic as well. So there are complaints from the urban community that that's not allowed. So I guess it's a reasonable constraint and complaint, but hopefully it's generic enough. On the Republican future, I guess I can approach it from a UK perspective. So we work in London as well. And so we're interested in the positioning of the London mayor and resilience building in London. And there are many things one can say about that. But one of the storylines, I guess, is that there has been an effort for 5 years or so to build a resilience capacity, which started off meaning kind of integrated development. And a lot of energy from local authorities as well as policy units in the mayor's office. And more recently, though, that's kind of disappeared, and it's now interpreted as civil order, and the local authorities are quite fragmented. So if that's an indication of the kind of political trajectory you're broadly talking to, I guess that's what we might see more of, quite a disempowered set of local actors who yet would have responsibility intellectually, if we're thinking of resilience, and potentially politically from the discussion that we've just had, but no capacity. So indeed, that's the worry. That the shift from the political to the technical narrative, I suppose, is a bright spot in response to that. If one can engage with the technical community and avoid some of the political kind of vast movements, if climate change can secure that position, there's more room for optimism, I guess. It has its own challenges. Harriet.
Okay, I'll take on the Republican question as well. I mean, I think there's a few different things there to think about America's changing position on climate change and how far that's now moved beyond what it is that the White House can control. I think one of those things is the relationship between China and America and the China-America deal, which was signed in September, which was probably quite critical to getting the whole Paris Agreement through, because they need to show each other their cards and be on the same wavelength. Now, there's more at stake in the Chinese-American relationship than climate change, but climate change is an important part of it, and it would be reasonable to argue that unpicking that part of it might put other relationships between China and America at risk that might not want to be put at risk. That agreement is also very heavily urban and very heavily subnational actor driven by California and some of the other major urban players in America, as well as Chinese cities. So there's a sort of multi-level structure there that would potentially kind of bind things beyond what the White House could undo itself. And that also then relates to what's happening in the US around climate change, which is not controlled by the White House, but is state level and city level action, of which there's been a significant amount. So it seems to me that rolling all of that back would be difficult for Trump to do, although of course he does like to do things, so you can't be totally secure about that. You also have a large number of significant economic actors in the US now, very much on the side of renewable energy, security. I mean, it's being driven by a security agenda, and that's okay as far as I'm concerned. So I think a lot of that is very difficult for the White House, whoever's in it, to undo. So maybe that's a cause for hope. Maybe that's not the case in the European Union, though. We'll leave that question because nobody's asked it. I don't want to answer it either. On the agriculture thing, I'll just say that I think one of the challenges going forward from Paris is to move the idea of taking climate action away from those sectors which are most obviously climate related, like energy and transport, into what you might want to call the kind of hard to reach sectors, which are heavy industry, the steel sector, petrochemicals, food and agriculture. How are we going to decarbonize the dairy industry? I don't know. So a lot of those kind of sectors which will have to be engaged in a process if we want to get to the kinds of
Just actually remind you, talking about sectors here, of course, two key sectors that, again, were not mentioned at all, were not included, were aviation and marine transport.
Yeah, but both sectors don't emit as much as the agricultural sector.
Right. I mean, Eva, on this question about states, we had a discussion in our workshop today about sovereignty and different types of sovereignty. Is Paris actually taking sovereignty in this regard away from states, and is that a good thing, a bad thing?
Well, I think some could possibly argue that through the Paris Agreement we see the return of the state in UN climate diplomacy, in the respect that suddenly now states are showing that they're willing to take action, which has been largely absent since Copenhagen. So we see the return of the state. I mean, the INDCs are the core of the agreement. That doesn't mean that states alone, and here we will sort of accomplish climate governance after Paris, which sort of connects to the discussion we just had about non-state engagement. But it's interesting with the role that the Framework Convention may play now after Paris, and perhaps we've seen in the 6 years that have followed since Copenhagen a gradual sort of transformation of the role of UN conference diplomacy, or the UNFCCC, as one which used to be associated with climate regulation, the single sort of locus of climate governance, to a role which is more about facilitation, coordination. We've introduced the terminology orchestration today, which is also something that sort of circulates in these debates. So rather than actually telling states and non-state actors what to do, the role of the Framework Convention is rather in sort of the UN climate regime to sort of facilitate, to benchmark, to sort of support climate action. I'm just wondering if I should comment on the agricultural sort of the role of agriculture in the agreement. According to my understanding and reading, I think there's a lot of politics around agriculture, which has to do with targets as well. So agriculture actually is associated with the debate on net emissions. And there was a great deal of resistance around this terminology in the negotiations leading up to Paris, and a lot of resistance from southern NGOs, for instance, suggesting that we shouldn't introduce loopholes of that kind into the agreement. So the possibility of offsetting industrial emissions through land use. So I think we should interpret the absence of agriculture in the agreement as an effect of that politics around sort of target setting and sort of not diluting the stringency of the 2 degree or 1.5. Also on the sort of the role of the US here as well. It may be useful to remind ourselves about the Kyoto legacy of the United States as well. So the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated with Al Gore as the representative of the liberal sort of the Clinton administration, and in many ways that administration exceeded its mandate in Kyoto. As you remember, the protocol was actually not ratified because it didn't pass the Senate and Congress. A lot of the sort of dynamics of UN climate multilateralism after, I would say, Kyoto has been around sort of bringing the United States back in. So we should also sort of interpret, I guess, the new pledge and review format or scheme that now is sort of institutionalized through the INDCs as a way of re-engaging the United States. The beauty of this arrangement is that it doesn't hinge on US ambition. Given the voluntary and flexible nature of the INDCs, other actors can be more ambitious, even though the United States sort of retreats from this process. So I think there is a history to all of this as well. It's also reflected in the current sort of policy architecture, if you will, of the Paris Agreement.
Okay, thank you. And Oliver, there was a question again about targets in the single dimension, the one dimension, what that does. What is, and also maybe from a German Berlin, how does a Republican victory look?
Well, if it would be Trump, maybe that would be the least worst option among the Republicans, because I think he doesn't really care about climate on local or regional levels. But yeah, what we have seen in the US in the last years is all based on executive orders of President Obama, the APA rulings, and many other things. The whole climate agreement of Paris is built around Obama's problems of ratifying. They had to find a structure that will allow Obama to sign the agreement in April and immediately after sign the ratification without going to Congress, because they wouldn't do it. So this kind of voluntary targets regime we have only to get the United States on board. And it's really a problem in Copenhagen. We wanted to have a 2 degrees compatible target with legally binding emissions reductions. 6 years later, we still wanted to have a 2 degrees compatible agreement, but it was crystal clear we wouldn't get legally binding emissions reduction targets from nation state. So we simply skipped that part, kicked the can further down the road and said, okay, we'll have this ratchet up mechanism. But why are we sure that this mechanism will deliver, let's say, in 5 or 10 years, what we have not been able to get right now and 6 years before? And of course, in the meantime, emissions have been increasing, so getting to 2 degrees is harder than it had been in 2009. So I would say it would really hurt if we would have a Republican president, because it could destroy the narrative. The narrative is now let's get to a groundswell of action. Everybody can do it on his or her own, and we will see a momentum growing. But if the US would drop out, the US federal government would drop out at the end of the year, when we know the results beginning November, many other actors would say, okay, maybe we should wait and see. And wait and see is a standard approach, has been a standard approach in the UNFCCC so far. So it depends a lot. I mean, climate action in the US will not stop. It depends a lot on what others are doing. But I would say, yeah, many things in the US depend on national regulation, and then the practice of executive orders by the president will dry up. One remark on food and agriculture. It's interesting that every stakeholder group now wants to see themselves represented in such an agreement. I have heard celebrations about now human rights for the first time is integrated into an international environmental treaty, but nobody could tell me what it actually means, but they're happy that they're in this treaty. And exactly here the question of negative emissions to be delivered by terrestrial carbon dioxide removal would mean, in a 2 degrees scenarios, 500 million hectares of additional land for biomass. So of course that has would have repercussions even in the political discussion on these targets. So diplomats decide not to talk about it and not to bother the political leaders with this question, because if we would seriously do that in Paris, India would immediately say, okay, we will stop that discussion on that kind of target. So that leads me to the question, okay, if we have a single unified temperature target, of course you have locking out effects of many other aspects that don't relate to the certain metric here, temperature and of course carbon, and what cannot be counted towards that target. There's a tendency that it doesn't count politically anymore. And on the other side, we could say, okay, many things, many types of interventions might be overestimated. So the most prominent example, and Mike wrote on this in his book on climate engineering, if you have a temperature target as the main target for 20 years, and you don't deliver on these emissions pathways, steep reductions, then you might think, okay, what is the last chance to deliver our temperature targets? And it might be solar radiation management then. It would be the logical thing if we are used to the thought, okay, it's all about keeping the temperature under a certain level. At least it's then legitimate to say, okay, shouldn't we try solar radiation management? We could end up in that kind of world if we only have this one very ambitious target, and some countries, and not even the bad guys, maybe it will be the good guys that say, and that I like about Mike's book about the scenario in it. It might be the good guys like Germany and France and the IOSIS countries who say, no, we have to deliver 2 degrees or 1.5 and then do it with solar geoengineering. It's just one scenario how we might proceed if we don't see proper action. But yeah, we have to think about locking out, locking in effects of certain targets.
Good, well thank you for all your comments. I think we are out of time. Actually we're 5 minutes over, so I think I will have to draw things to a close here. We have answered 1 or 2 of the questions, not all of them. We haven't actually answered the question about what happens if Britain votes to leave the EU. And we haven't asked even the question, we've been talking about governing climate after the Paris Agreement. Well, how would we actually govern a thermostat if we actually did go down this more radical route of a solar radiation management scenario? And many other questions, of course, will still be with us in 10 months' time when everyone gets together again at Marrakesh and for the next round of negotiations. So who knows, we might be back here in 12 months' time running another debate. Anyway, thank you all for coming tonight to this. Thank you also for Mark and Harriet and Eva and Oliver. for your contributions and helping us think through some of these questions together. And there are some drinks and drinks. What else? Next door in the Great Hall. So please feel free to come and join us for that.